Halal is something that Allah has permitted. Something that Allah has permitted. And the haram is something Allah has forbidden. Clearly, scripturally. Right? Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it clear in scripture that something is halal, or made it clear in scripture that something is haram. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the halal, although it appears, from what I've just said, it sounds like, oh, it's clear. It's clear, but it's open. It's clear, but it's open. And what I mean by that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't take it upon himself to list for us all of the things that are halal. There's no such thing in the Quran, right? Often, in certain contexts, we understand something is permissible in contrast to something that Allah has clearly forbidden. Okay? And therefore, often the halal is clear, not because there is a list of all that is halal, but rather the halal is clear because the haram is clear. Does that make sense? And there's a verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lists some examples of things that are haram, saying that only these things are prohibited, as if to limit the haram to a few things, right? And leave the halal open. Leave the halal open. And it's based on verses like that the fuqaha came up with the principle that outside of the domain of worship, where the Sharia is somewhat prescriptive, right? The rule is that any matter that isn't clearly prohibited is permissible. Anything that is not clearly prohibited is permissible. And therefore, knowing what is permissible is simply a question of knowing what is prohibited. If you know what's prohibited, if you have knowledge of what is prohibited, then you know what isn't, and therefore you know what is permissible. And in that sense, there is a word for it which is known as mubah. Right? Mubah. And mubah is something that is value neutral, meaning you can just do it. Right? Can I sit here? Well, of course you can. Right? Can you sit there? Oh, yes, you can. It's mubah. There's the question. You don't even need to ask the question. You even know instinctively that it's fine, because you know there is no reason for you to think that it isn't permissible. Right? Something you might think something is impermissible only because it now has some sort of connection to the haram, or it's triggered something in your mind that you think is impermissible. So really, your understanding of what is permissible is directly connected to what you know that is impermissible. Okay? And really, Islamic jurisprudence is essentially an explanation of that which is halal and that which is haram. In between, there are things that are mushtabihat. So the hadith continues, وَبَيْنَهُمَا, between them there are things that are mushtabihat. And the hadith continues with an analogy actually, in which the Prophet ﷺ goes on to say, like the shepherd whose flock is grazing around a forbidden pasture. كَالرَّاعِ يَرْعَى حَوْلَ الْحِمَى. It's possible, because his flock is around forbidden pasture, that one of them might stray into the forbidden pasture. Okay? And therefore it's best that that forbidden pasture is clearly avoided. That one keeps a little distance from it so that you don't end up. Yeah? So, it's like, you park on a double yellow. Well, that's already forbidden, but anyway. But you park on it, you're thinking, oh, maybe I won't get the ticket. Well, you're putting yourself at risk. Now, practically, one of the juristic forms of the ambiguous are things that are classed in Sharia, legally classed as makruh or disliked. Now there's a reason why things are declared makruh. One is because there's a hadith that declares it makruh, that says it's disliked. But a more common reason is because it isn't clear. It's not clear that it is haram. Does that make sense? Meaning that the fuqaha have tried to be as clear as they can with regards to things that are haram. When they couldn't, because they felt that textually the evidence wasn't clear enough, or because the text doesn't mention it, meaning there isn't a direct or indirect prohibition. Okay, so direct prohibition is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned it in the Quran. This is haram. Usury is haram. Indirect, Allah hasn't mentioned it clearly in the Quran, but there is a principle in the Quran that this issue is violating. The principle doesn't spell out this particular thing, but it is the principle, but this issue can come under that principle. And here you end up in the domain of interpretation. Okay? And this often happens with new things that come up that are considered harmful. That perhaps in the era of in early Islam, or in the era of revelation, meaning when revelation was coming down, when the Quran was being revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, these things didn't exist. Okay, so a common example is like something like smoking. And don't ask me any questions about smoking. I'm just giving you an example, all right? So there's no verse in the Quran that says cigarettes are haram. There's no hadith that says cigarettes are haram. There was no such thing as cigarettes back then. However, when it became clear that cigarettes are harmful, right? Other verses that principally prohibit harming oneself. لا تقتلوا أنفسكم. Do not destroy yourselves. Right? لا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة. Do not subject yourselves to destruction. These types of verses were used to say this should be impermissible because doing this thing is subjecting oneself to harm, right? Or to destruction, and therefore one should avoid it. However, fuqaha particularly, and here I won't mention the differences between the fuqaha because it will complicate things. But here the fuqaha have looked at this and said, you know what? Because there's no clear mention of this item, this product, cigarettes, right? We won't say that it is haram because haram requires textual prohibition. But we will call it makruh. Okay? We'll call it makruh. And by makruh it means that it is disliked to the degree of prohibition, but the term haram can't be used. Because this is an interesting way of understanding this hadith, because al-halalu bayyin. Because the Prophet ﷺ said that halal is clear, and if something isn't textually clear, we can't call it haram.